Hey Yabome, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Great, thanks so much for joining us in the studio today and for taking the time to tell us about your book. So first, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
So my name is Dr. Yabome Gilpin-Jackson, and my field of study is human development. So I research, I teach, I consult in the field, which means I work a lot with leaders and senior strategists that are looking at the best way to develop their organizations, their teams, and often their community groups from where they are to where they want to go, and to address the challenges that they have. It's something I love doing, and I also like writing in general, which is why I wrote Identities, as well as often write for academic publications as well.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. So part of the reason we wanted to have you here on the show is Identities is, of course, a short story collection about the global African experience, but there's a lot of stories in it that speak specifically to the Sierra Leonean experience and to the Freetown experience. And can you just tell us a little bit maybe about one of those stories and what motivated you to put it in the short story collection?
Well, when I think specifically about the Freetown experience, there were quite a few. Someone pointed out to me that even in the stories that specifically were not centered around Freetown, that I paid some kind of homage to Freetown. I didn't actually realize that I did that. But in particular, the one that's really close to my heart about the Freetown and Sierra Leone experience was the one about Furby College. So there's a story net called Once Upon a Time at Furby College. And it pulls together just some of my own experiences while I was there, but also that experience when we used to be on campus at Furby College, just the student life, the being together, the building relationships, the social connections that you made at Furby College at that time, especially in the context of living on res. But then all of that story was anchored in the experiences of the Rebel War, and specifically for people who were in and around Freetown around January 6th, 1999, and the years building up to that. Just the experiences of that, of being on campus and hearing about friends that had lost family in the provinces, and empathizing with that, but still having a rather distant experience of it until it arrived in Freetown.
Right.
And so that story is really dear to my heart.
Yeah, that was a really great one of my favorites in the book. So can you just give listeners, of course Identities is a short story collection, but can you give listeners sort of a clue into what motivated you to write this? So what was your inspiration behind sharing this global African experience and sharing sort of the experience of being asked who you are and how you come to terms with answering that question? So what was your main motivation for writing this book?
Right. In general, my motivation came out of, as I mentioned, my field is human development, and so I speak at a lot of conferences, and I make a lot of connections. And this one time, I had been talking to just a colleague about my background, probably inspired again by being asked the question, "Where are you from?" So I've had so many versions of answering that question, and I had explained a few things to a colleague about my background, who I was, etc. And she ran across a conference for African leadership. So I didn't necessarily study African leadership. I studied leadership and human development in general. And she sent it to me and said, this sounds a lot like you. It sounds like what you studied and who you are. You might want to be part of this conference. So I looked at it, I submitted an abstract to speak at the conference. But before submitting the abstract, what actually happened for me is reviewing the conference call for submissions and realizing that I was quite irritated actually by the topics on the list. So a lot was about the usual, the war, the conflicts, the post-colonial and colonial and slavery heritages of Africa. And I just looked at it and thought, this is so behind even the contemporary leadership literature that I study and that I support leaders in looking at. And so I submitted an abstract that started with, I know this is not a topic you asked for, but what might we do about African leadership now and into the future? And it got accepted. So I spoke at the conference, but speaking there meant I did a lot of research, and I just got really inspired around, there's so much more to tell. And because I had studied a lot about how narrative shapes perceptions and reality, I was speaking at that conference and then at another conference similarly. I looked at the audience and thought, I like speaking to this audience because I know that they shape higher education and social policy. But I also want to speak to an everyday audience. I want people like me and colleagues and friends and everyday African leaders to know that we have a part in owning and shaping our own narratives, because so much of the African narrative and the Black African narrative is defined for us out in the Western world. And so that really inspired me, and I thought, I used to like writing creatively. It's probably time to go back to that if I want to reach a broader audience.
Yeah, great. And I think one of the most appealing things about the book, which a friend was mentioning to me, is that you can read it, and having grown up in Freetown, spent time in Freetown, you can actually see how the stories appeal to your own experiences.
Right.
So instead of reading about some Western place maybe you've never been to, or somewhere that you're not really that interested in, you're reading about things that could have actually happened to you or your sister or your brother. So I think that's one of the greatest parts of the book for me.
Thank you.
So why do you think listeners should go out and get a copy of the book, and where can they get a copy of the book? Freetown.
So when I wrote the book, I wrote it predominantly for a global African audience, that global African experience, that African, there's so many of us now that live all over the world and continue to identify with our African and specifically our Sierra Leonean heritage. So initially I wrote it for that audience, and like you said of your friend, what I've been pleasantly surprised by is that people of not just Sierra Leoneans that live here in Sierra Leone, but other Africans all over the world, and even non-Africans, have told me how much this book has touched everyday experiences. So I think if you're a Sierra Leonean, both living in Sierra Leone, you will identify with parts of the book, and definitely global Sierra Leoneans, it speaks to that experience of being out in the world and other people trying to define you and put you in a box. And you sort of getting a sense of, okay, but who am I in this, and what image of myself and of Sierra Leone and of Africa do I want to leave people with? So I wrote it intentionally to be thought-provoking in that way, and to have people think about maybe the questions of their own identity that they may not have yet resolved. So I think Sierra Leoneans here will find that appealing, will find questions that they want to think about. They have relatives that live abroad, they interact with people abroad, they travel in and out as well. And so that experience, maybe being at some airport once you leave Sierra Leone and being asked where you're from and going, why are they asking me? I think people will identify with, as well as the questions of what can we do to continue to develop Sierra Leone, right? All of that is in the book. And then where can it be found? It's at Panja Limited. There's some limited copies there. And my hope is to continue to send copies into Sierra Leone if people are interested in the book. So Panja is at 118 Wilkinson Road.
Okay, great. And for all of our listeners listening overseas via TuneIn, you can also get copies of the book on Amazon, I believe, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so you can go to Amazon.com and order your copy there as well. So Yabome, thank you so much for being here with us in the studio today. If you could just give us one more, let me say, your biggest take home from writing the book, your biggest inspiration, what you learned from writing the book that you would love to pass on to listeners.
I think for me that's anchored in the Sierra Leonean saying, if you don't know, if you know Sabusa, you come, you know Sabusa, you go. If you don't know where you came from, you won't know where you're going. And I mean, doing this book, I pride myself on being Sierra Leonean as well as now having lived in Canada the longest. But doing this really anchored me and reminded me again of who I am and of my heritage, and why it's important for me to continue to represent being Sierra Leonean in the world. And so my takeaway is that in order for us to develop, of course we need our basic needs met, but identity is, there's that chicken and egg relationship between having basic needs and developmental needs met. When you're clear about who you are, you'll also fight for your own development. And but you also need your basic needs met, which you can also fight for if you're clear about who you are and where you want to go. So for me, it's all about that. So just really encourage people to take a look at the book. There's also a discussion guide. I've run into a couple of groups here in Sierra Leone that are hosting conversations with young women, with different kinds of women's groups, other groups. This is for everyone. It's not just, it's for all genders. It's not just for women. But I've just run into a lot of women that are hosting dialogues. There is a discussion guide along with it that really helps get to those core questions and for people to explore where do we want to go and therefore form their own identities.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being here in the studio with us today. That was Dr. Yabome Gilpin-Jackson. She's the author of Identities, and you can pick it up at Pangea at 118 Wilkinson Road, or also on Amazon. So thank you so much for being here with us today, Yabome.
An absolute pleasure.
And we will be right back after this. I have the BBC News coming up for you, so don't go anywhere.
Gross.